We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of
liberty and freedom. We often like to think this is the stuff America is made of. But our nation's history is more complex and bittersweet than that. During the century and a half between the arrival of the first English colonists in Jamestown in 1607 and the outbreak of the American Revolution in 1775, England's North American colonies grew rapidly, pouring their raw materials and agriculture into a booming international economic system. In doing so, the American colonials developed the highest standard of living in the Western world. But American colonies depended heavily upon forced labor, at first indentured servants, then African slaves, carried to the Americas against their wills and often treated with inhuman brutality. America would be built upon slavery as well as freedom, on the labor of enslaved Africans and Native Americans, as well as European indentured servants and colonists. While certain regions were settled by people escaping religious persecution, the American colonies' endurance and growth depended primarily upon their ability to produce wealth. America was rich in furs, wood, and fish. It also had some of the most fertile soil in the world, perfect for the growing of tobacco, sugar, and food crops in enormous demand in Europe. The New World provided Europeans with what they could not produce themselves, and in doing so created a vast Atlantic trade system that revolutionized the Western world. This system was built upon an economic plan known as mercantilism.
Mercantilism is designed to create a profit for the largest number of people and to use people as efficiently as possible to maximize a profit. And when you look at a merchant is in business to make money, to produce more than he or she can actually consume. And therefore you can sell it to someone else and end up with more. And to some extent, that's what mercantilism is about.
In a world of competing nations, the objective was to become economically self-sufficient and to export more goods than you imported, so as to accumulate wealth and avoid being dependent upon other nations. England wanted to link itself and its colonies into a vast but exclusive trading area that was as self-sufficient as possible. To help do so, the English Parliament passed a series of navigation laws requiring that only British subjects could ship or market colonial goods, and that a special list of products which were of great value in world markets must first go to England, where they would be processed and refined, then resold to other countries. The system was great for both the colonies and England, where it created jobs and generated enormous profits from the sale of the finished products and manufactured goods to other countries and its colonies. Sugar produced in the West Indies was the key to the whole system. Sugar was once so precious that wealthy Europeans would will it to their relatives, like money or a house.
Sugar is one of the most important words in the dictionary when it comes to understanding the way the New World worked. It became a great crop. It delivered enormous profits to the growers of sugar and the shippers of sugar because the sweet tooth of Europeans grew and grew and grew.
Once the Spaniards and Portuguese discovered they could grow it in the New World, production soared and prices dropped. Europeans' insatiable craving for sugar stimulated a huge, highly organized industry in the Caribbean and Brazil. New World sugar flooding European markets drove down prices, converting it from a luxury item to a dietary staple.
Sugar was also a killer crop for those who grew it because it required a ferocious expenditure of labor and a terrible work regimen in the harvesting of sugar. Several million human lives are eaten up in sugar fields, in tropical weather. It was terribly punishing work.
New World sugar was grown by West African slaves. More slaves were carried from Africa to the New World to grow sugar than for any other reason. By the mid-1700s, England had emerged as both the world's leading producer of sugar and the major provider of African slaves to the New World.
The pleasure, glory, and grandeur of England has been advanced more by sugar than any other commodity. Sir Dolby Thomas.
African slaves were people who came from proud people in various parts of Africa. And they took to slavery with great difficulty. It was a terribly brutalizing experience. And they often would run away. When they were recaptured, they were beaten, they were maimed, they were branded.
Sugar planters were so eager to make as much gold from the sugar that they converted every inch to sugar production.
Those slaves in the West Indian sugar islands had to be fed, so they were fed by fish caught off New England cod banks. They lived off wheat grown in Pennsylvania and New York, sometimes off beef grown in the middle colonies. Almost everyone in the Americas was tied into the sugar trade and into the slave trade. And that sugar, of course, ended up in people's tea and coffee in Boston and Philadelphia and New York. All part of this interconnected, slave-based economy where sugar was one of the big cash crops. Sugar was almost king.
The Puritans in New England grew rich by trading fish, meat, fruit, and grain to feed slaves, and by supplying wood for barrels to ship sugar.
The sugar would go to New England or wherever and be processed into rum, and then it might go to Africa to be traded for slaves. And the slaves brought over to the West Indies and traded for sugar.
Such trading voyages, often involving many stops and exchanges along complex trade routes, could last for months or years. With an abundance of rich soil and a climate suitable for agriculture, the middle colonies became the breadbasket of the American mainland, producing large amounts of grain and livestock for export to the West Indies and Europe. Independent family farmers from the British Isles and Germany marketed their produce through the port of Philadelphia, which by the mid-1700s was the second largest city in the British Empire. South of Pennsylvania, agriculture was also the primary source of wealth. But there, agriculture was conducted on large, highly organized plantations, manned by enslaved Africans. The most populous and profitable of England's mainland colonial regions was the Chesapeake, which provided tobacco for European smokers and chewers. When the prices of tobacco dropped in the 1700s, Chesapeake growers planted wheat and other grains and joined in the West Indian trade. Cut off from the Atlantic Ocean by long barrier reefs, North Carolina remained a small colony. Its main contribution to the empire was forest products, including pitch, tar, timber, and masts for ships. The Deep South at first exported tobacco, wood products, and deerskins. But the warm climate and the low-lying, often marshy areas of South Carolina and the new colony of Georgia were ideal for the cultivation of rice, exported to England for resale to southern European nations. After the 1740s, South Carolinians also grew indigo, which produced a deep blue dye highly valued in Europe. England's mainland colonies were blessed with abundant natural resources and fertile soil. Europe and the West Indies would buy all the tobacco, wheat, rice, timber, and other commodities that North America could produce. But one essential element that the whole system needed to work was always in short supply, and that was labor. But such workers were always in short supply. So where could the English colonies find the massive number of people needed to do all the work? colonists throughout the 1600s tried unsuccessfully to enslave Indians. Many of the Indian nations were powerful enough to resist conquest. Indians who were captured either refused to work, died of disease, or ran away. Next, colonists turned to indentured servants, who came first from England, then from elsewhere in the British Isles, and from mainland Europe.
In Europe at this time, there was something of a population explosion. Consequently, there were not enough jobs in Europe for everyone. When the New World was discovered, and when they had heard about the New World and the opportunities of land, many of them were tempted to go.
The colonies found part of the solution to their labor needs through forced labor and indentured servants. During the colonial period, 50,000 English convicts escaped the hangman's noose by agreeing to work in the colonies. Lured by the chance of a better life, poor people signed contracts called indentures.
What was an indentured servant? If I'm an English youth and want to get to America, I will sign a contract saying that I will give 7 years of labor to a master who will pay the price of a ticket to get across the Atlantic on a ship. But when I sign that contract, I'm in for 7 years of extremely tough labor. I might not survive it, because that master, I'm just a piece of property. He can do with me what he wants. I don't work hard enough, he can beat me. If he doesn't like the way I work, he can sell me to a neighbor.
Indentured servants accounted for 3/4 of the 130,000 English who came to the Chesapeake in the 1600s. Most of them were young men between the ages of 15 and 24. As many as 2/3 of all the Europeans who came to Britain's North American colonies south of New England in the colonial period came as indentured servants.
During the voyage, there is on board these ships terrible misery, stench, fumes, horror, vomiting, many kinds of seasickness, fever, dysentery, headache, heat, constipation, boils, scurvy, cancer, mouth rot, and the like, all of which come from old and sharply salted food and meat, also from very bad and foul water, so that many die miserably.
Going to the colonies was a highly risky proposition. Those who survived the long voyage across the Atlantic then had to live through a period of seasoning or adjustment to the New World environment, which typically involved a bout with one or more contagious diseases.
I am not half a quarter so strong as I was in England, and all is for want of victuals. For I do protest unto you that I have eaten more in one day at home than I have allowed me here for a week.
English colonials often treated their indentured servants little better than slaves, especially in the Chesapeake. They separated families and worked them 60 to 80 hours a week. Living conditions were harsh. Masters had the right to beat their servants and often fed them poorly. 4 out of 10 indentured servants never lived long enough to become free. Despite the hardships and deaths, tens of thousands of people survived and eventually became freeholders of their own land. In the 1700s, the new Middle Atlantic colonies, with their healthy climates and fertile soil, attracted immigrants from Ireland, Scotland, Germany, and elsewhere in Europe. Their appeal, coupled with the easing of population pressures in England after the 1680s, meant that the Chesapeake colonies couldn't get enough indentured servants to grow their tobacco.
Indentured servants, once they have completed their service, which can be typically 7 years, become economic competitors. Once they achieve their freedom, they get their own land, they compete with their previous employers in the cultivation of tobacco or as wheat growers or whatever. Indentured servitude does not answer the labor needs of the Chesapeake tobacco growers, and they, in the mid-17th century, begin to switch over to African slaves. to do their cultivation.
Although quite a few wealthy Puritans kept a slave or two, the practice never caught on in New England. In the Chesapeake, however, planters found the solution to their labor needs in slaves imported from the sugar islands of the West Indies. Settlers in Jamestown bought their first African slaves from Dutch traders back in 1619. But up until the 1680s, enslaved Africans in the Chesapeake were few in number.
And initially they're treated much the same as indentured servants. But as the tobacco industry grows and as more and more Africans are imported into the Chesapeake, you have the development of an institution of chattel slavery.
In the 1600s, there were free Africans who were farmers, had land, built their own houses, their children were free. But gradually, as Virginia and Maryland and the Carolinas turned to enslaved labor, then the black freedmen became an exception rather than the rule. But some would always be there right down to the American Revolution. But it became more and more difficult as these white colonists began to associate black skin with slave condition.
Color becomes the great dividing line. There have been other dividing lines before, religion, what have you. Color becomes the great dividing line for English living in the New World. Race matters more here than it does anywhere else.
In the 1700s, slavery spread throughout England's New World colonies and became an indispensable source of labor and wealth. For the British Empire, black gold, as some called it, became a commodity second in value only to sugar. North America never received more than a fraction of the close to 12 million Africans brought to the New World. Nevertheless, by 1775, the 500,000 African Americans in Britain's mainland colonies represented 20% of the population, and 90% of them lived south of Pennsylvania. When English sugar planters from Barbados came to the new Carolina colony in the late 1600s, they brought their slaves with them.
You have to recognize that the English, coming from a northern climate, do not have the knowledge or skills of how to live in a semi-tropical world. And the Africans did. So English colonists in the Deep South in particular were in West African expertise and skills. West Africans had the knowledge of how to cultivate rice, how to fish. Their dugout canoes were more efficient than the English barks. West Africans quickly developed an expertise in local medicinal herbs and plants that the English did not have. So really the South Carolina and some of the other southern colonies were dependent upon African know-how in order to survive and prosper.
The similarity of South Carolina's environment to West Africa's and the large number of blacks in the population ensured that West African culture would survive in many forms.
African Americans created their own culture. They, in effect, said, we will be our own people. You cannot make us into what you would have us be. We might work for you, but you will never control our true selves. And out of this emerges not just an African American culture, but the beginnings of a separate people.
Over 400 languages were brought here, spoken by my ancestors. So they had to find a way of communicating, and they did. Some call it Creole, some call it Gullah, but it's still spoken today. It was made so that we could survive and be able to communicate with one another here.
Tropical diseases carried there from the Old World made the Deep South a deadly region for human beings, especially Northern Europeans. After 1720, slaves outnumbered whites in South Carolina more than 2 to 1. Planters throughout the southern colonies were wholly dependent upon African slave labor. Working knee-deep in mosquito-infested rice paddies, many slaves also died from malaria and other diseases.
As long as the oceanic slave trade was operational, the planters, the individual planters, found that it in fact was cheaper to work these slaves to death rather than to rear them themselves. That is to say, rather than breeding slaves, they would rather buy them from the oceanic slave trade and work them to death.
It is pitiful to see how they crowd those poor wretches, 650 or 700 in a ship, the men standing in the hold tied to stakes, the women between decks, and those that were with child in the great cabin, and in that hot climate occasions an intolerable stench. James Barbette.
The Middle Passage, as the transoceanic shipment of human cargo was called, was a living horror, as James Barbette and others who voyaged on the slave ships recalled.
Being in a confined space, if anybody was ill with an infectious disease, that soon spread. So we have these terrible stories of entire shiploads dying.
Seeing women throwing their babies overboard, let alone themselves, because they knew that where they were going, where they were headed, was something so terrible. Not only were they taken from their homeland, Africa, they were taken from their families, their life source. And who wants to be taken from the life source? No one, no human being wants to be separated from their family.
New World planters paid so much for slaves that a slave trader could lose over half his human cargo and still make a handsome profit. Once in the Americas, many Africans continued to resist. In 1712, black and Indian slaves in New York killed 9 whites before they were overwhelmed, then burnt, hung, or broken on the wheel.
What would a master do with a slave who burned the barn or committed crimes of various sorts? Well, some masters would try to use force, greater and greater force, to break the resistance of the slave. Others would give up and sell the slaves. Our history is simply filled with how violence had to be applied every step along the way. It is impossible to maintain a system of slavery without violence. The violence of masters and the violence of resisting slaves.
The English trade in slaves became an essential part of the Atlantic commercial system, along routes historians once called the triangular trade.
When the demand for slaves had increased, many of these societies in Africa started going to war solely to obtain slaves. So the turmoil of the slave trade was terrible inside of Africa. For every slave that was brought across the Atlantic, some died in Africa in the wars. So we must consider that the toll on human beings inside Africa and on their political structures was enormous.
One of the great contradictions or paradoxes in American history is how a people who would become the champions of liberty and freedom could practice slavery. Interested primarily in regulating external trade, England let the early colonies govern their local and internal affairs by themselves. Less than 20 years after the first English settlers arrived in North America, they had functioning systems of self-government. In 1619, England ordered the Virginia Company to establish a local representative assembly called the House of Burgesses, which was modeled on the English system of local self-government. In New England, self-government also arose out of religious ideals of Pilgrims and Puritans. Before ever touching on shore, the Pilgrims drew up and signed the Mayflower Compact, an agreement to form a body politic and follow the regulations agreed upon by the majority.
It was a form of government in which they agreed to elect annually the governor and the assistants that would be like their legislature. The importance of this Mayflower Compact is twofold. One, it is an early example of people, Europeans, coming to this New World, this English New World, and engaging in self-government. The second thing that I think is interesting about this is that it was written down. It was a written charter. And this, too, becomes a tradition in America. The idea that basic rights are written down in some form.
The New England Town Meeting, attended by most free adult males, became a model of democratic self-government. Very quickly, the colonial governments came to mimic the English political system, which subjects of the British Empire believed to be the best in the world. At the heart of the English system was the idea of balance, power distributed among the monarchy, or government of the one, aristocracy, or government of the few, and democracy, or government of the many, was believed to maximize the rights of all, while too much control by any one of the three would lead to tyranny. The colonies attempted to follow this model in their own governments. Despite the fact that the royal colonies were officially ruled by the king and proprietary colonies by wealthy gentlemen or aristocrats, their assemblies took on more and more powers. They won the right to meet separately, to call out the militia, to introduce legislation, and most importantly, to tax. Control of the colony's purse strings gave the assemblies power over the governors, who were dependent upon them for their salaries. Relations between the colonies and England became tense at times. The colonies ignored those navigation laws that interfered with their ability to make money. American ports became havens for smugglers and pirates like Captain Kidd, who paid off the governor to use New York City as a base of operations. Angered at their violation of the navigation laws, King James II, in 1685, had combined the northern colonies into the Dominion of New England, abolished their assemblies, and placed them under the rule of Sir Edmund Andros, who shut down the town meetings, imposed taxes without colonial consent, and otherwise curtailed the privileges that the liberty-loving colonials had enjoyed during decades of English neglect. 3 years later, the English kicked King James off the throne in what they called the Glorious Revolution. And New York, Maryland, and Massachusetts staged their own revolutions to kick out unpopular governors. The Dominion of New England was dissolved, but Massachusetts never did regain its charter. It remained a royal colony, with its governor appointed by the king. American colonists treasured their sacred rights as English subjects. Deeply influenced by writings of English Whig pamphleteers who warned British subjects of the threats of tyranny at home, Americans were very protective of their own assemblies and gave their own meaning to the concepts of liberty, freedom, and equality. But what most distinguished English from American politics were two things. First, the North American colonies were a lot more democratic than England. While only a small fraction of Englishmen could vote, more than 50% of the adult male population in the colonies were freeholders with the right to vote. Second, slavery and freedom grew together in America, one supporting the other.
English colonists knew what slavery was, and in seeing that, knew what liberty and freedom were. They gave meaning and definition to each other.
It's hard for us in the 20th century to imagine these ideas of having power over another person. But for 17th and 18th century people, power over people, control over people didn't feel as strange, and there were certain kinds of rules about who could have power over which people. Parents had control over their children and had power over them, and they were expected to. Kings had power over their subjects, so that having power over one's workers was not all that alien an idea. The actual carrying out of it, however, distressed many people. It distressed Thomas Jefferson. It distressed a number of Quakers in the 1680s who said, this just doesn't seem fair that these people work so hard and then are never allowed to have their selves back. And all through the 1730s and 40s, more and more voices were raised. How come we don't just have power over these people in the way we're accustomed to having power? We actually have power over their whole lives and are free to treat them inhumanely.
The God who holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked.
In 1734, the religious spirit that had brought the early Puritans to New England seemed a distant memory. Out in Northampton, Reverend Jonathan Edwards began to preach fiery sermons to his congregation about their sinfulness and need for salvation that set off a renewal of intense religious faith.
The Great Awakening is one of the most important events in American colonial history. First of all, it was a revival. It was a great revival of religious enthusiasm. Secondly, it was the first truly national event in American history because it was a revival that didn't just happen in one place, in Maine or in Georgia, on the coast or in the interior. It was a revival that was spontaneously being spread across through the agency of itinerant preachers who went from place to place, so that this religious enthusiasm was carried from the coast into the interior, from New England into the South, and it echoed, it reverberated for years thereafter.
Gripped by the Holy Spirit, people trembled and wept and called God back into their lives. As emotion and spirituality became more important, the power of the older clergy diminished, and the emphasis of religion shifted from being a member of the church to the shared experience of being saved. The focus on personal faith also called into question one man's right to own another.
Think you that your children are any way better by nature than the poor Negroes? No, in no wise. Blacks are just as much and no more conceived and born in sin as white men are.
The message of equality, spread during this period known as the Great Awakening, had a deep impact on American colonists, who began to question not just the authority of their ministers and the morality of slavery, but their political leaders' claims to special privilege as well.
They are a mixture of English, Scottish, Irish, French, Dutch, German, and Swedes. From this promiscuous breed, that race now called Americans have arisen. I can point out to you a family whose grandfather was an Englishman, whose wife was Dutch, whose son married a French woman, and whose present 4 sons have now 4 wives of different nations. Monsieur Crèvecoeur, 1770.
Immigration from Europe had soared during the 1700s. On the eve of the American Revolution, half the population south of New England was non-English. And the colonies were filled with native-born Americans who had lived their whole lives in the New World. So who were these new Americans? To English visitors, many Americans seemed ambitious and presumptuous country bumpkins.
Their government, religion, and manners all tend to support an equality. Whoever brings you your victuals sits down and chats with you.
Most Europeans looked down upon American colonists. But there were admirable traits about the new American as well, traits embodied in a man who came to personify the new American character more than anyone else, Benjamin Franklin of Philadelphia. Indentured to his older brother, a Boston printer, Franklin had run away to Philadelphia when he was a boy. There, through hard work, common sense, and practical morality, he became a rich printer, and then quit business to devote himself to science and the betterment of his community. In Europe, one's position in life was determined at birth. Free from restrictions of the old world, Franklin's American was the self-made man, an individual, free to make choices and to rise above the station of one's birth. And although he spoke and dressed like a plain commoner, his accomplishments in many fields made him the equal of any European. The American colonists had greater educational advantages, economic opportunity, freedom of speech, press, and assembly than even the English. They had more representative governments, greater religious and social toleration, and could also boast of the highest literacy rate in the Western world. So who was this new American? Was he a money-grubbing opportunist or a deeply religious idealist? A slave-holding tyrant or a freedom-loving Democrat? A throwback to a more primitive past or a pioneer of a better future? England's underestimation of this new American would have momentous consequences. For in the 1770s, the North American colonials would wage a successful war for independence and undertake an experiment in representative government that would change the course of world history.